Good evening and welcome. Tonight, I thought that I would read to you some history magazine articles about Vikings. I have two really cool articles in here that don't really fit into any specific category, I should say, because these aren't your average Viking tales. The first one we're going to read is about raiding the Mediterranean. Let me see if it's on here. Yes, and the Atlantic crossing, Vikings in North America. So this isn't your typical Viking history lesson. This is about obscure Viking history. So let's just get right into it. Let's see if I can find the article here. It's kind of an older issue, as you can tell. Let's see. I need a table of contents. There we go. Vikings in the Mediterranean. Let's read about their adventures. Kringla Heimsens Suer Manfodbygger. These are the words that open the 13th century history of the kings of Norway. Written in Old Norse, the language spoken in medieval Scandinavia, it means the orb of the world which mankind inhabits. Penned by an Icelandic chronicler, Snorri Sturluson, the history is an important source on the Vikings, who held Europe in thrall from the 8th to the 11th centuries. Their trading and raiding sent them to the far horizons of that orb, sailing west to Britain, then Greenland, and even reaching North America. As well as their infamous brutality, Viking success depended on navigational skills, essential not just to navigate Europe's rivers and Atlantic coastline, but also to venture south from their homeland all the way to the Mediterranean. That great sea, as Snorri Sturluson describes it, that goes in through the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to the land of Jerusalem. Evidence of Viking settlements in England, Ireland, and Russia, and their trade routes as far as present-day Istanbul and Serkland, which is the land of the Saracens, i.e. Baghdad, is plentiful. The Vikings' Mediterranean foray, however, is a more shadowy affair. According to the handful of sources available, it took the form of a remarkable and audacious raiding voyage led by a hell-raising naval commander who brought terror to Muslim Spain, France, and Italy. He sent his boats south, probably with the ultimate objective of sacking what must have seemed a tempting prize, Rome. The Northmen arrive. In the late 700s, farming communities in today's Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were overpopulated, which fed the desire to expand and seize goods. In the following centuries, the people of Scandinavia used their longships to carry out lightning raids, as well as establish far-flung trade routes. Despite how they are discussed today, these people did not call themselves Vikings, thought to mean pirate or bay dweller. They most likely would not have seen themselves as a united people. The Viking Age is often said to begin in 793, the year of the raid on a wealthy Christian community of Lindisfarne in northeastern England. In the following decades, the Vikings secured a trading post in Ireland. Later raids against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England led to Viking settlements in parts of northeast England. There we go. Centered on the old Roman fort of Borkum, which the Vikings called Jorvik. York. How interesting. Meanwhile, the Northmen were expanding eastward too, developing trading posts in Russia, a country whose name derives from the Rus, a Viking tribe. The Vikings used the Volga and Dnieper rivers to reach the Caspian Sea and from there traded with Baghdad. These indefatigable raiders also looked south to the lands once ruled by Emperor Charlemagne. At this great king's death in 814, France, Belgium, northern Spain, western Germany, and Austria became vulnerable as division and weakness quickly seeped into their lands. The Vikings recognized an opportunity and regarded France as a particularly valuable prize. In 843, Vikings took over the Breton island of Noirmoutier, using it as a base to launch more attacks on the French mainland. In 845, Viking longboats sped up the Seine, sacking numerous cities and finally Paris. Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, responded in what would become a standard method of dealing with Vikings. He paid them to go away. Moving toward Rome. The Viking scourge, however, continued. Little by little, the Northmen gained a foothold in northwest France, in Normandy, the peninsula that bears their name. Familiarity with France may have tempted Viking leaders to move farther south. In 859, they turned their attention to the Mediterranean. Historians rely on four main sources that document this voyage, which was commanded by Bjorn Jarnsitha, Bjorn Ironside, so named because of his invincible reputation. Before his Mediterranean foray, he had established a fearsome track record, sacking Paris circa 857. These chronicles describe how in 859 Bjorn Ironside and another chief, Hastin, joined forces and sailed down past the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, then largely controlled by the Muslim Umayyad dynasty. They were not the first Vikings to venture so far south. Sources attest to a raid on Seville in 844. Following in the wake of that earlier voyage, Bjorn's crew sacked towns on the coast of modern Portugal. The fleet then passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, becoming perhaps the first Vikings to enter the Mediterranean. At Algeciras, they burned down the mosque. Then they moved to the southeast of the Iberian Peninsula. After a diversion to North Africa, where they took on slaves among the Blue Men, which is a Viking term to describe Africans, they sacked Spain's southeastern coast, then the Balearic Islands. Continuing northward across the Mediterranean, they reached the kingdom of Roussillon, which in what is now southwest France. There they established a camp in the Camargue region near Nîmes, where they overwintered, accumulating loot. The following year, 860, after a diversion up the Rhone River, the Viking expedition anchored off the coast of Italy, where the most colorful of the Viking exploits took place, the looting of Luni near the modern Italian city of La Spezia. Founded by the Romans, Luni had become prosperous during the Middle Ages and had a strong system of defenses. According to the main source for this story, the early 12th century chronicler Dudo of Saint Quentin, the Vikings mistook Luni in its splendor for Rome. Faced with Luni's mighty fortifications, the Vikings relied, Dudo claimed, on trickery to get inside. After faking Hostein's death, the Northmen sent several messengers to the city gates, asking if their leader, who had converted to Christianity, could be buried in hallowed ground within the city walls. Wailing is heard from the Vikings, the clamor of deceitful grief. The bishop summons the people from throughout the city. The clergy came dressed in their vestments. The women came in throngs, soon to be led into exile. With the trap sprung, the corpse of Hostein sprang to life, killing the bishop, slew the people, and opened to his shipmates the gates of what they took to be Rome. On discovering it was not the eternal city, the Vikings supposedly lost heart and embarked for the long voyage home. Facts from legend. Most historians believe the Viking confusion of Luni for Rome and the Vikings' spin on the story of the Trojan horse to enter the city is exactly what it sounds like, a good yarn, with little basis in fact. Dudo of Saint-Quentin is considered an unreliable source. The three other main sources that mention Bjorn's incursions in the Mediterranean, Saxo Grammaticus's Deeds of the Danes in Latin, and the Icelandic works The Tale of Ragnar's Sons and the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, are all from the 12th and 13th centuries, written long after the 9th century events they recount. Bjorn is described as the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, who is probably an amalgamation of several Viking warlords. Historians believe that Bjorn did exist, and documentary evidence elsewhere suggests the broad details and route in the chronicles are based on fact, even if the command of such a fleet by Bjorn Ironside cannot be definitively established. Spanish sources confirm violent Viking incursions in 859, while Arab sources describe a Viking raid around this time in Nekor in North Africa. In circa 858, the abbey at Arles-sur-Tech in Roussillon was indeed raided, probably by Norsemen, and historians have found evidence of a Viking winter camp in the Camargue near Nîmes. Other sources suggest that Pisa was sacked by a Viking fleet, and that between the summer and autumn of 860, the Vikings reached Fiesole. Although the Mediterranean never became a major theater for Viking raids, Bjorn's successors would later follow in his footsteps. In France, the Viking presence in what became Normandy evolved. The wild men of the north settled down, adopted Christianity and the French language, and became Normans, retaining their Viking fierceness and prowess in battle. Before and after their invasion of England in 1066, Norman warriors seized swaths of southern Italy from the Byzantines and Sicily from the Muslims. The magnificent churches they built there in the Norman style are a lasting legacy of their Mediterranean adventure, an echo of the audacious voyage undertaken by their kinsman Bjorn Ironside 2 centuries before. Very interesting story, isn't it? And let's get into the next article. Vikings in North America. Let's see. Here, nope. Not quite there. Here we go. The Vikings in Canada. Transatlantic sagas. Anyone standing today by the wind-swept shore of Paves Bay at the northern tip of Newfoundland might find it hard to comprehend the enormity of the modest archaeological site that extends around them. Here at Lonzo Meadows, the name is probably a garbled reference to an old French naval vessel, lies what is still the only known Norse settlement in North America. A few humps and bumps in the grass, a replica building, and a fine museum mark the point of first contact between human populations across the Atlantic. It is an astonishing place, but its significance was only recognized in relatively recent decades. Until as late as the 1960s, the Viking adventure in North America was known only secondhand from the Icelandic sagas, the great epic tales that form one of the jewels of northern medieval literature. These stories mostly concern the Viking Age of roughly 750 to 1050, but they were written down hundreds of years later, primarily in the 13th century. The degree to which they preserve genuine memories of the saga writers' ancestors, or whether they are more a form of historical fiction, still divides scholars today. The entire narrative of Norse voyages to North America is contained in just two of these texts. The Saga of the Greenlanders, or let's say the Grönlandinga Saga, and the Saga of Eric the Red, Eirik Saga Rauta. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it at all, but I did my best. Sagas and sources. Although the two sagas describe events in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, they are preserved as separate collections of shorter tales in very late medieval manuscripts. The Saga of Eric the Red is generally agreed to be originally a 13th century composition, but there is disagreement as to the date of the Saga of the Greenlanders. Some scholars argue for the early 1200s, while others go as late as the 14th century. This dispute aside, both sagas tell the story of an unknown country west of Greenland, found by ships blown off course, with exploring expeditions and the brief settlement that follows. In fact, the two sagas frequently contradict each other, with different versions of who first sighted land, who was the first to sail there, and even the number of separate voyages involved. The route they took, however, is clear in both sources: west from Greenland for 2 days to a country of flat stones that the Norse called Helluland, which was probably Baffin Island, then south past a long stretch of coastal forests and pristine beaches they called Markland, which was probably Labrador, and then finally to Vinland, the land of wild vines. Its location is never entirely clear, not least whether it refers to Newfoundland or, more likely, to somewhere farther west or south. In the Saga of the Greenlanders, the picture is credible in its complexity and involves multiple journeys to Vinland. Acting on the reports of one Bjarni Herjolfsson, who finds the new land but does not go ashore, first landfall is made by one of the most famous individuals of the late Viking Age, Leif Erikson, aka Leif the Lucky. He founds a settlement called Leifsbutir, Leif's houses, which he then lends out to subsequent travelers. There are several voyages mentioned after Leif's, first by his brother Torvald, who remains there for 3 winters, then a major effort as settlement by the prosperous trader Thorfinn Karlsefni, or Karlsefni a nickname which means something like a real man, and his wife Gudrid Torbjarnadottir, and finally a voyage jointly led by Leif's sister Freydis and 2 partners who were brothers. In the Saga of Eric the Red, which seems to have been written slightly later, all this is compressed into a single Vinland voyage. This time it is Leif himself who first sights Vinland, but does not go ashore. Instead, the attempt at settlement is entirely by Thorfinn and Gudrid, who bring 3 ships with 160 settlers. This time 2 camps are mentioned, an overwintering site called Straumfjord and a longer-lasting place called Hop. It is not hard to combine the 2 sagas into a tale of several voyages with a more or less reliable cast of characters. It seems likely that the Norse established themselves in more than one place, perhaps making one substantial settlement with temporary way stations set up as they explored further. All the stories are vivid and rich with detail, human drama, and description, but one thing shines through to modern eyes, that this was no discovery, because Vinland was already inhabited. In both sagas, the Norse repeatedly encounter local people whom they call Skralingar, a derogatory term meaning something like savages. In the Eric saga, 2 groups initially trade in peace before violence eventually breaks out over a misunderstanding. In the Greenlanders' version, there is lethal conflict from the start. There are deaths on both sides, and a common theme is that the Norse are ultimately forced to flee because of the indigenous resistance to their presence. From the literary record, it appears that the Norse community in Vinland was quite short-lived, a few years at most. It quickly became only a memory preserved by the Greenlanders, which eventually found its way into the Icelandic sagas. Facts on the ground. Archaeological finds have corroborated the sagas' accounts of a short-lived Norse settlement in North America. The new finds are shedding light on which aspects of the sagas have a basis in historical reality and which perhaps do not. The breakthrough came in the discovery of the site of Lonzo Meadows in Canada by the Norwegian wife and husband team of Anastina and Helga Ingstad in 1960. The Norse dwellings uncovered at Lonzo Meadows are modest, 8 buildings of turf, clustered in 3 groups. Excavations at the site, undertaken first by the Ingstads and later by Birgitta Linderoth Wallace and others, identified workshops and a smithy located at a distance from the other structures, both for access to running water and to minimize the risk of fire. One might be a boat shed, and there is clear evidence for woodworking and ship repair. 2 finds above all confirm the site is Norse, a ringed cloak pin of a classic type and a stetite spindle whorl. There is also a bone needle, jasper fire starters that probably came from Greenland or Iceland, a wood debitage, which is material produced in the process of whittling or carving, that has been worked with metal tools. The site has excellent sea views and access to marine resources, especially rich cod fisheries and eider colonies. It was the perfect place on the southward coastal route of ships coming from Greenland, at the point where they could then sail on in several directions. Perhaps 100 people could have lived there, or a little more, a number that fits quite well with the saga descriptions. The settlement could easily survive the winters, with its familiar wind-proof and insulated architecture adapted to the North Atlantic. It seems almost certain that Lonzo Meadows was not the only Norse settlement in North America. Too many aspects of the site argue against it being the sole foothold. Where, for example, are the burials or the evidence for animal husbandry? The sagas mention livestock, but if true, there's no sign of them on this site. Archaeologists and others have long looked for more sites of this kind, but nothing has been confirmed so far. A few years ago, hopes were briefly raised with some promising signs from Point Rosie, in an approximately equivalent location to Lonzo Meadows, but on the southwest coast. Sadly, further fieldwork confirmed that all features on the site were natural, and the search for an elusive second site continues. Most scholars think it likely that Lonzo Meadows was a long-term base camp, a place to rest up, to resupply and provision, and to prepare for the winter ahead. In the spring and summer, expeditions could have set out to explore, looking for trade items, including exotic foods like butternuts, and perhaps above all for timber to fell, a vital commodity in the treeless landscapes of Greenland and Iceland. Permanent settlement does not seem to have been an objective of these Norse explorers. First Nations. It is clear that Lonzo Meadows was also intermittently occupied by indigenous peoples. They were there before the newcomers, and they returned afterward. The Norse buildings were destroyed by fire, but it is not clear who did this. Was it the last of the voyagers as they sailed away, or an entirely different act by the local people? These indigenous peoples are believed to be the ancestors of the Beothuk, though this is unconfirmed. Today they are visible only in fragmentary glimpses in the sagas and a few objects recovered from the excavations. The presence of the First Nations people is felt in other ways too. A Norseman buried in Greenland was found to still have a stone arrowhead in his body. He must at least have lived long enough to make it home. Fur from the North American bison, a plains species not native to Newfoundland, has been found in another Greenland grave. Very interesting. It's going to be crooked here. The pelt's presence is evidence for trade over long distances. Most dramatically, a coin minted for King Olaf III Haraldsson of Norway in the late 11th century was found on a Native American settlement in Maine that was occupied more than 100 years later. The coin was much eroded and pierced for suspension as a pendant. Who knows how many hands it passed through and for how long to get there. Traces of Finland. Norse sagas that describe these North American voyages are unclear about dates, and of course, they were composed centuries after the events they claim to relate. There is a general consensus that the action takes place sometime either side of the year 1000. The earliest secure reference to Vinland, with confirmation that the name related to wild grapes, comes from the 1070s, when it was mentioned in passing by the Germanic cleric Adam of Bremen in his ecclesiastical history. Interestingly, he describes it as an island, notes that it was a place visited by many, and that he had heard about it from the reliable reports of the Danes. Since the majority of the North Atlantic voyagers seem to have come from Iceland and Greenland, this report implies that a basic knowledge of a land across the Atlantic was fairly widespread in Northern Europe within decades of the first Norse landfall. Until recently, the archaeological material from Lonzo Meadows had only a broad chronology, with objects of general late Viking Age type and a radiocarbon date range from about 990 to 1050. However, in 2021, a remarkable study by Margot Coytams and colleagues was published in the journal Nature, detailing the use of a new kind of radiocarbon calibration based on spikes in solar radiation, which meant objects could be dated to exact years. Several pieces of wood relating to the Norse occupation were all shown to have been cut in the same year, 1021, a decade or so later than the previous best estimate, though it is not too far off from the sagas. It is wise not to become too fixated with this precise year. Clearly, it marks a period of major activity on the site, but it may have been established earlier and can equally have been reoccupied afterward. Something of this intermittent nature has been revealed in studies by Paul Ledger and colleagues, analyzing samples from a peat bog near the site. Telltale organic matter, which archaeologists call ecofacts, and cultural deposits suggest that the Norse occupation may have lasted well over a century, though not continuously. Indigenous occupation spans an even longer period, and it is possible that the area may at times have been a shared place of interaction. This idea aligns well with an Icelandic annal that refers to Norse ships collecting timber in Markland as late as the year 1347, an activity that was apparently thought unremarkable. In an exciting development, the same region, rendered as Markalada, was recently identified by Paolo Chiesa in the Chronica Universalis, a Milanese work from about 1340. Clearly, rumors of a place west of Greenland really had reached the Mediterranean world 150 years before Christopher Columbus went west. There is no doubt whatsoever that the Vikings journeyed to North America in the early 11th century and made a major camp in northern Newfoundland. They probably sailed to unknown lands beyond, still to be explored. Equally certain is that there's also a First Nation story of this encounter, and this too may one day emerge from the archaeological record. And that is going to be it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very, very good night. Okay, there's a dog barking, so let me wrap this up quickly before it gets too loud.